Today we have a story about courage that history almost forgot, a night when evil came dressed in white sheets, and righteousness answered with iron resolve. This is the account of Grace Holloway and the Mount Zion Baptist Church, recorded in her own hand during the dark days of 1898. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. The following testimony was discovered in the basement archives of the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Coopersville, Tennessee, preserved in a tin box alongside church records and a faded photograph. The author, Grace Holloway, served as the church secretary from 1896 until her death in 1942. My name is Grace Holloway, and I set down this account while the memories remain sharp and the truth still burns clear in my mind. What transpired on the night of November 14, 1898, must be preserved, though speaking of it even now makes my hand tremble upon the page. I had come to Coopersville 2 years prior, after my mother's passing left me alone in a world that showed little mercy to colored women without kin. The town sat in a valley where the Cumberland Mountains cast long shadows, and the Tennessee River ran cold and quick. I found work as a seamstress and cleaning woman, and I found solace at Mount Zion Baptist Church, where Reverend Thomas Porter preached a gospel of dignity and quiet resistance. Reverend Porter was a tall man with silver threading his dark hair, and hands that had known hard labor before they learned to hold a Bible. He spoke softly, but his words carried weight. "Grace," he told me when I first arrived, "this church is more than timber and nails. It is a promise that we exist, that we matter, that we will endure." The church stood at the edge of town, a simple white-painted building with a modest steeple and clear windows that let in the morning light. On Sundays, our voices rose in hymns that seemed to shake the very rafters. On Wednesday evenings, we gathered for prayer and fellowship. The church was our sanctuary, in every sense a place where we could breathe freely, speak our truths, and remember our humanity. But there were others in Coopersville who found our existence intolerable. Magistrate Horace Beaumont ran the town with the certainty of a man who had never been questioned. He owned the general store, the grain mill, and most of the farmland surrounding Coopersville. He sat in the front pew of the White Baptist Church every Sunday, his Bible bound in fine leather, his collar starched, stiff as his convictions. When he walked down Main Street, men tipped their hats and women nodded with downcast eyes. I first encountered Magistrate Beaumont on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I had been hired to clean his office. He required his floors scrubbed and his windows polished once a week. The work was honest, and the pay kept me fed. "You're from that colored church," he said, without looking up from his ledger. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. Mount Zion Baptist." He made a small notation with his pen, the scratch of it loud in the quiet room. "I hear your reverend has been teaching reading lessons. 2 children." "Yes, sir. Reverend Porter believes education uplifts the soul." Magistrate Beaumont set down his pen and looked at me then, his pale blue eyes cold as January frost. "There are rules in this town, girl. Old rules, good rules. They keep order. They keep peace. Your people would do well to remember their place in that order." I kept my gaze respectful, my voice level. "We mean no trouble, sir. We only wish to worship and live our lives. Trouble," he said slowly, "is not always what we mean to cause. Sometimes it is simply what we are." He dismissed me with a wave, but as I gathered my cleaning supplies, I noticed something on his desk, a list of names, written in careful script. I recognized several members of our congregation. Beside each name was a notation I could not read before he covered the paper with his hand. "You're dismissed," he said again, sharper this time. That night, I told Reverend Porter about the list. He listened in silence, his face grave in the lamplight of his small office behind the pulpit. "They are watching us," he said finally. "They have always been watching, but something has changed. I can feel it in the air, Grace, like the pressure before a storm." 2 weeks later, the first warning came. We arrived at church on Sunday morning to find the word "Beware" painted across our front door in thick white letters. The paint was still wet, dripping down the wood like tears. Reverend Porter stood before that door for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back. Then he turned to our congregation, 40 souls gathered on the church steps, fear and anger mingling in their eyes. "We will clean this," he said quietly, "and then we will worship. We will not be moved by threats or hatred. This is our church. This is our home. We cleaned the paint away, but the message had been received. Something dark was stirring in Coopersville, and Mount Zion Baptist Church stood directly in its path. The warnings continued through November, like a fever building slowly toward crisis. Each one was calculated to unsettle without quite breaking any law that Magistrate Beaumont himself might have to enforce. On a Wednesday evening, we found our hymn books scattered across the churchyard, their pages torn and trampled into the mud. On Sunday morning, someone had nailed a dead crow to our door, its wings spread wide in a grotesque mockery of crucifixion. Each time, we cleaned the desecration in silence and continued our worship. But the true cruelty was quieter than vandalism. Mr. Jacob Turner, who ran the sawmill, dismissed 3 of our church members from their positions. No explanation given, no wages owed, simply told not to return. Mrs. Helen Crawford, who had worked as a cook for the white Methodist pastor's family for 12 years, found herself replaced without warning. One by one, members of our congregation lost their livelihoods, and everyone knew why, though no one dared speak it aloud. I continued cleaning Magistrate Beaumont's office every Tuesday. He never mentioned the incidents, but I could feel his satisfaction in the air, like smoke from a distant fire. He would sit at his desk, writing in his ledgers, occasionally glancing up at me with eyes that held no warmth, no humanity, only the cold arithmetic of power measuring itself against resistance. "Your Reverend still teaching those reading lessons?" he asked one afternoon, his pen scratching across paper. "Yes, sir." "Foolish man. Education gives people ideas. Ideas lead to dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction leads to disorder." He blotted his page carefully. "I am a patient man, Grace, but my patience is not infinite." I said nothing, focusing on scrubbing a spot on the floor that did not exist. "Tell your Reverend that this town has rules. Invisible rules, perhaps, but rules nonetheless. Some people seem determined to test how far they can bend before they break." When I left his office that day, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely button my coat. That evening, I found Reverend Porter in the church, standing alone before the altar. The November sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him like grasping fingers. "He threatened you," I said. It was not a question. "He threatened all of us," Reverend Porter replied. "But we have faced threats before. Our people have endured far worse than the malice of small men in small towns. This feels different, Reverend. This feels organized." He turned to look at me then, and I saw fear in his eyes, not fear for himself, but fear for his flock. "I received a letter this morning, unsigned, but the message was clear. They are planning something, Grace. Something they believe will drive us from this place forever. What should we do?" "Pray," he said, "and prepare." 2 days later, a stranger arrived in Coopersville. His name was Captain William Foster, and he wore the weathered blue uniform of a Union Army veteran. Though the war had ended more than 30 years prior, he was a white man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen terrible things and survived them. He attended our Sunday service without invitation or explanation, sitting quietly in the back pew, his presence both comforting and unsettling. After the service, he approached Reverend Porter with his hat in his hands. "Reverend," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "I served with the 23rd Colored Infantry during the war, fought beside men braver than I could ever hope to be. I have been watching this town, and I have seen the signs. You are in danger." "We know," Reverend Porter said quietly. "I don't think you understand the scope of it. There are men gathering, men with sheets and torches. They plan to come for this church, and when they do, they will not come alone." The air seemed to freeze between us. "How many?" I heard myself ask. Captain Foster's expression was grim. "Hundreds. They are calling members from 3 counties. They mean to make an example of you to show what happens to colored folk who refuse to know their place." That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my small room at the boarding house, listening to the wind rattle the windows, and I thought about fire. I thought about screams. I thought about Mount Zion Baptist Church reduced to ashen memory. But I also thought about Reverend Porter's words, "We will not be moved." Somewhere in the darkness, a dog began to howl a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry all the sorrow of the world. The next morning, Reverend Porter called a special meeting of the church elders. I was not an elder, I was only 24 years old, and had been in Coopersville less than 2 years, but he asked me to attend as secretary. To keep a record of what was decided, we gathered in the church basement, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of earth and old hymn books. Besides Reverend Porter and myself, there were 5 others: Deacon Marcus Webb, a stonemason with hands like granite; Sister Ruth Campbell, a midwife who had delivered half the babies in the colored quarter; Brother Isaiah Thompson, an elderly man who had been born into slavery and carried the scars to prove it; Sister Ella Harrison, a school teacher with a spine of steel; and Brother Samuel Price, a young farmer with quiet strength. Captain Foster was there as well, standing against the back wall like a sentinel. Brothers and sisters, Reverend Porter began, we face a trial unlike any we have known, but we are not without resources, and we are not without allies. Captain Foster stepped forward. After the war, I made it my business to remember the men who fought for the Union men of all colors, who believed in something larger than themselves. Some of them settled in these mountains. I have sent word. 20 of them are coming here. Sister Ruth asked, why would white men risk themselves for us? Because some debts transcend the color of a man's skin. Captain Foster said simply, because they remember who stood beside them when musket balls were flying. Because it is right. What do you propose? Deacon Webb asked. The clan will come at night, as they always do. Cowards prefer darkness. They will expect fear and submission. Instead, we will give them something they have never encountered: preparation and resistance. Over the next 3 days, the plan took shape in whispers and careful preparation. The 20 Union veterans arrived in Coopersville in small groups, traveling separately to avoid suspicion. They were men in their 50s and 60s now, their uniforms long packed away, but they carried their rifles with the practiced ease of those who had faced death and learned its rhythms. They were loggers and farmers, shopkeepers and blacksmiths, but they had once been soldiers, and that knowledge lived in their bones. They came to the church after dark, entering through the back door 1 or 2 at a time. I served them coffee and cornbread while Captain Foster reviewed the defense plan. We will position ourselves in the choir loft and along the upper windows, he explained, pointing to a rough sketch of the church interior. We will not fire first, but if they attempt to burn this church or harm anyone inside, we will respond with precision and discipline. I watched these men as they checked their rifles and counted ammunition. Some of them caught my eye and nodded with a respect I had rarely seen from white men. They did not speak much, but their presence was a kind of shield, imperfect, perhaps, but real. Meanwhile, strange things began to happen in town. Magistrate Beaumont's ledgers went missing from his office. I knew because I was there when he discovered it, his face turning the color of a storm cloud. He questioned me sharply, but I told him truthfully that I had seen nothing. The ledgers reappeared 2 days later, returned as mysteriously as they had vanished. What they had been copied or photographed, I could not say. But Beaumont's paranoia grew visible. Bow members of the congregation reported odd occurrences: white sheets stolen from clotheslines, horses spooked in the night, wagon wheels mysteriously loosened. Nothing violent, but enough to spread unease among those who had planned to ride against us. On the night of November 13th, Reverend Porter gathered the church members who remained, about 30 souls who had refused to flee despite the warnings. Tomorrow night, they will come, he said, his voice steady in the lamplight. But we will be ready. Those of you with children, take them to the Johnsons' farm tonight. The rest of you, if you choose to stay, know that you are choosing to make a stand. I will not judge anyone who leaves. This is not your fight alone. No one left. That night, I wrote in my journal by candlelight, we are not warriors. We are seamstresses and farmers, cooks and teachers, but we are also human beings who have decided that some things are worth the risk. Tomorrow night, we will see if courage can stand against hatred. Tomorrow night, we will see if justice has any power in this dark corner of Tennessee. I slept fitfully, and in my dreams I heard the sound of drums, or perhaps it was only my own heartbeat, counting down the hours until confrontation. When I woke on the morning of November 14th, the sky was the color of old bruises, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, each note falling like a judgment yet to be delivered. The 14th of November dawned cold and gray, the kind of day when the sky presses down like a lid on a coffin. I went about my usual duties, mending clothes at the boarding house, purchasing bread from the bakery, avoiding eye contact with the white faces that watched me with undisguised hostility. The town felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of collective anticipation. Men gathered in clusters outside the general store, their voices low but excited. Women whispered behind their fans at the dry goods shop. Everyone knew something was coming, though the details remained unspoken in polite company. At noon, I went to clean Magistrate Beaumont's office as scheduled. I almost considered skipping the appointment, but that would have signaled fear, and fear was precisely what they wanted. Beaumont was waiting for me, seated behind his desk with his fingers steepled before his face like a prayer or a judgment. "Grace," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice that frightened me more than anger would have. "Sit down, please." I remained standing. "I have work to do, sir." "Sit down." I sat, perching on the edge of the hard wooden chair across from his desk, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from trembling. "You are an intelligent woman," he began, studying me with those cold blue eyes. "More intelligent than most of your kind, certainly. That is why I am extending you a courtesy I would not offer to others." He opened a drawer and withdrew a document, placing it on the desk between us. "This is a train ticket to Memphis. It is dated for this afternoon. There is also $20 here enough for lodging and a fresh start." He slid the items toward me. "Take them. Leave Coopersville today. Do not come back." I stared at the ticket, at the money, at the escape being offered. "And if I refuse, then you will suffer the consequences of your stubbornness, along with the rest of your congregation." His voice remained calm, almost reasonable. "Grace, I am trying to save your life. What happens tonight is beyond my control. Forces have been set in motion that I cannot stop, even if I wished to. The best I can do is offer you this chance." "Why?" I asked, meeting his gaze. "Why offer me anything at all?" He was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "Because you remind me of someone I once knew. Because, despite everything, I am not entirely without mercy." He leaned forward. "Because when they burned that church to the ground tonight, I would prefer not to have your death on my conscience." The casual way he spoke of burning the church, the certainty in his voice sent ice through my veins. "You could stop it," I said quietly. "You are the magistrate. You have the authority to prevent this." "I have the authority to maintain order," he corrected. "And sometimes order requires difficult actions. Your people have been warned repeatedly to remember their place. They have refused. Tonight, they will learn the consequences of defiance." I stood slowly, leaving the ticket and money on his desk. "I will not abandon my church," I said. "I will not abandon my people. If you have any humanity left in you, Magistrate Beaumont, you will stop what is about to happen." His expression hardened. "Then you are a fool, and fools do not deserve mercy." "Perhaps," I said, walking toward the door, "but I would rather die a fool among friends than live a coward among strangers." As I reached for the door handle, he spoke again. 300 men, Grace. They are gathering from 3 counties. 300 men with torches and rope and righteous fury. Your 20 soldiers and, yes, I know about them, cannot stand against that number. This is not courage. This is suicide." I turned back to look at him one final time. "You are wrong about one thing, Magistrate. You said this is beyond your control. But you organized it. You sanctioned it. You are as responsible for what happens tonight as any man in a white sheet. And that burden will follow you all the days of your life." I left his office and walked into the cold November afternoon, my heart hammering but my steps steady. That evening, as the sun set behind the Cumberland Mountains and darkness spread across Coopersville like spilled ink, I made my way to Mount Zion Baptist Church for what might be the final time. The church was quiet when I entered. The 20 Union veterans were already positioned in the choir loft and at the upper windows, invisible from outside but ready. Reverend Porter stood at the altar, his Bible open before him, his lips moving in silent prayer. I took my usual seat in the third pew and waited. Around me, the other church members filtered in silently, faces I had come to know and love over the past 2 years. We did not speak. There was nothing left to say. Outside, in the gathering darkness, I heard the first sounds of hoofbeats and wagon wheels. They were coming. The sound began as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the mountains, but it did not fade. Instead, it grew steadily louder, the measured rhythm of many horses, many wagons, many feet marching with unified purpose toward Mount Zion Baptist Church. We sat in the dim lamplight of the sanctuary, 30 souls holding our collective breath as the enemy approached. Reverend Porter stood at the pulpit, his hands resting gently on the worn wood, his face calm despite the fear I knew he must be feeling. In the choir loft above us, the 20 Union veterans remained invisible in the shadows. Captain Foster had been firm in his instructions. No movement, no sound. absolute discipline, until the moment if it came when they must reveal themselves. I closed my eyes and listened to the approaching horde. I tried to pray, but the words scattered in my mind like leaves before a storm. Instead, I thought of my mother, gone these 2 years, and wondered if she could see me now. I hoped she would understand. I hoped she would be proud. "They are here," Sister Ruth whispered beside me, her hand finding mine in the darkness. Through the tall windows of the church, we could see them beginning to gather, first dozens, then scores, then what seemed like hundreds of white-robed figures emerging from the night like ghosts made manifest. They carried torches that turned the darkness into a hellish orange glow. They rode horses and sat in wagons, forming a great circle around our small church. 300 men, Magistrate Beaumont had said. Looking out at the sea of white sheets and flickering flames, I believed him. They did not charge immediately. Instead, they surrounded us completely, cutting off every avenue of escape. The circle tightened slowly, methodically, like a noose drawing closed around a condemned neck. This was part of the terror, the waiting, the anticipation, the certainty of doom approaching at its own leisurely pace. A voice called out from the darkness, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "Reverend Thomas Porter, we know you are in there. Come out and face justice for your crimes against the natural order." Reverend Porter did not move. His eyes remained closed, his lips still moving in silent prayer. The voice came again, harder this time, edged with impatience. "You have 5 minutes to evacuate that church. 5 minutes to send out your women and children. After that, we will burn it to the ground, with or without you inside." I felt Sister Ruth's hand tighten on mine. Across the aisle, Deacon Webb sat with his jaw clenched, his massive hands gripping the pew in front of him, hard enough to make the wood creak. Still, Reverend Porter did not respond. The minutes crawled past like wounded things. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent in my ears. I could hear the breathing of those around me, quick and shallow, the breath of prey animals sensing the predator's approach. Outside, the white-robed figures began to chant. It started low and rhythmic, building in volume until it seemed to shake the very air. "Burn it down, burn it down, burn it down." Then I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, the splash of liquid against wood. They were dousing the outer walls with kerosene. "Reverend," I whispered, unable to keep silent any longer. "They mean to do it." He opened his eyes and looked at me with a sorrow so deep it seemed to contain the grief of generations. "I know, child, but we will not run. We will not beg. We will remain here, in this house of God, and we will trust in something larger than hatred." A new voice called from outside, one I recognized immediately. Magistrate Beaumont had come to witness his handiwork. "Reverend Porter, I gave your secretary a chance to leave this afternoon. She refused, just as you are refusing now. The blood of everyone in that church will be on your hands. Is your pride worth their lives?" For the first time, Reverend Porter moved. He walked slowly down the center aisle, toward the front doors, and every eye in the church followed him. When he reached the entrance, he threw open both doors. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the torchlight beyond, the chanting stopped. 300 men fell silent, waiting for his surrender. Instead, Reverend Thomas Porter's voice rang out clear and strong across the assembled hatred. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" A collective growl rose from the white-robed crowd. "When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell." "Silence him," someone shouted. But Reverend Porter continued, his voice rising like a trumpet. "Though a host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this will I be confident." That was when they lit the first torch and threw it. It arced through the darkness like a falling star, tumbling end over end until it struck the side of the church with a wet thump. Flames began to spread where the kerosene had been poured, licking up the white-painted walls with terrible hunger. Reverend Porter stepped back inside and closed the doors. "Positions," Captain Foster said quietly from the choir loft, and I heard the subtle click and slide of 20 rifles being readied. The fire was spreading quickly now, filling the church with the acrid smell of burning paint and wood. But something else was happening too, something I only understood when I heard Captain Foster's next command: "Hold," because the clan had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed we would panic, that we would flee through the doors in a terrified rush, easy targets for the violence they had planned. They had assumed we were sheep awaiting slaughter. They did not know about the 20 rifles aimed at them from the darkness. They did not know that every man in that choir loft had survived the war, had faced Confederate fire at Gettysburg and Vicksburg and Shiloh. They did not know that Captain William Foster had kept records, names and addresses of every Klansman he had identified in 3 counties, documents now safely deposited with sympathetic authorities in Knoxville. They did not know that their comfortable anonymity, their white sheets and hidden faces, were about to become useless. "Show yourselves," Captain Foster called out into the night, his voice carrying with military authority. "We have 20 rifles in perfect shooting positions. We know who you are. We can see your horses, your wagons, your faces beneath those hoods. If you want blood tonight, you will pay for it with your own." Silence fell like a stone. Then, one of the Klansmen laughed a cruel, confident sound. "You're bluffing. There's no one up there but colored folk too scared to fight." Captain Foster's response was simple and devastating. Muzzle flash left window. Fire. A single shot rang out, impossibly loud, in the tense silence. One of the torches in the crowd exploded into sparks, struck from a man's hand by a bullet that had missed flesh by inches. The laughter died. "Next shot," Captain Foster said calmly. "Will not miss." The atmosphere shifted like the moment before a storm breaks. The 300 white-robed figures, so confident in their overwhelming numbers just moments before, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they had not anticipated, an enemy with position, preparation, and the cold willingness of men who had already stared death in the face, and survived. A murmur of confusion rippled through the clan ranks. Some men shifted nervously on their horses, others took half steps backward, their torches wavering in unsteady hands. The fire they had started against the church wall continued to burn, but more slowly than they had intended. Our men had soaked the interior walls with water that afternoon, buying us precious time. Magistrate Beaumont's voice cut through the uncertainty, sharp with authority and barely concealed fury. "This is a bluff. They cannot have more than a handful of rifles. We are 300 strong. Advance." But no one moved forward. I said, "Advance." Captain Foster's voice answered from the darkness of the choir loft.com and measured. "Magistrate Horace Beaumont, I can see you clearly from here. You were standing beside the 3rd wagon from the left, wearing a white robe over your gray suit, the same suit you wore to your office this morning. If you order these men forward, you will be the first to fall. Is that clear enough for you?" I heard Beaumont's sharp intake of breath even from inside the church. His anonymity, his protection, had been stripped away in a single sentence. "How dare you, Mayor Edmund Walsh," Captain Foster continued, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "standing near the oak tree, your hands shaking so badly you can barely hold your torch. Sheriff Martin Kincaid, mounted on the gray horse, your deputy beside you, Judge Harold Preston, you should be ashamed. You took an oath to uphold justice, and yet here you stand with these cowards." One by one, Captain Foster named them. 20 years of careful observation, of recording faces and voices, of building evidence against the men who had terrorized colored communities. Across 3 counties all of it was being deployed now with surgical precision. The effect was devastating. Men began pulling off their hoods, their fear of identification overcoming their bravado. Others turned their horses, seeking escape routes that did not exist. The very circle they had formed to trap us now trapped them in turn, compressed into a killing ground where 20 expert marksmen held every advantage. "You cannot do this," Magistrate Beaumont shouted, and I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. "We are the law in this county. You are murderers and terrorists," Captain Foster interrupted, "and we are armed citizens defending a house of worship against arson and assault. I wonder which case will hold up better in federal court." The mention of federal court sent another wave of unease through the crowd. The Compromise of 1877 had ended Reconstruction and left the South largely to its own devices, but federal courts still held jurisdiction over certain crimes, and attacking a church with documented evidence might qualify. Reverend Porter moved to stand beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "They are breaking," he whispered. "Can you feel it?" I could. The certainty that had brought 300 men to our door was crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. They had expected easy victims and found determined resistance. They had expected anonymity and found themselves exposed. They had expected fear and found courage that refused to yield. But broken men are sometimes more dangerous than confident ones. A voice I did not recognize shouted from the back of the crowd. "We cannot let them live to tell of this. Burn the church, shoot into it, kill them all, and deny everything." A roar of angry agreement rose from a portion of the crowd, the men too deep in to retreat, the true believers who would rather commit massacre than admit defeat. "Light the walls," someone screamed. "Burn them out." A dozen more torches sailed through the air, striking the church walls, the roof, the windows. Flames began to spread in earnest now, climbing toward the wooden shingles, filling the sanctuary with smoke that burned our eyes and throats. "Hold positions," Captain Foster commanded his men, his voice steady despite the growing inferno. "Do not fire unless fired upon. Make them be the ones who start the killing." The smoke was getting thicker. I could hear coughing from the other church members, see the fear in their eyes as they realized the fire might succeed where intimidation had failed. Then I heard another sound, distant at first, but growing rapidly closer. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming fast from the direction of town. The clan heard it too. Heads turned, torches swung toward the approaching sound. Magistrate Beaumont's voice carried a note of triumph. Reinforcements. More men from but the riders that burst into the clearing were not wearing white robes. 20 more horsemen, colored men from neighboring towns and counties, armed with rifles and grim determination, formed a line between the church and the clan. Leading them was a face I recognized from photographs: Marcus Johnson, a state representative from Knoxville and the highest-ranking colored official in Tennessee. "Stand down." Representative Johnson's voice boomed with authority. "By order of the governor of Tennessee, this assembly is illegal. You are commanded to disperse immediately." He held up a document, official seals visible even in the torchlight. "I have here a declaration from Governor Robert Taylor himself, authorizing the use of state militia to protect Mount Zion Baptist Church and arrest any person who threatens it. That militia is currently riding from Knoxville and will arrive within the hour. Any man still present when they arrive will face federal charges of conspiracy, arson, and attempted murder." It was learned later that the militia was still being assembled and would not arrive until morning, but it was a bluff, delivered with such conviction that it broke the last of the clan's resolve. Men began to flee, first in ones and twos, then in a great rushing wave as panic overcame pride. Horses scattered, wagons overturned, white robes were abandoned in the dirt as 300 men discovered they were not quite so brave when facing consequences. Magistrate Beaumont stood frozen in place, watching his army dissolve into the night. His face, illuminated by the dying torches, was a mask of impotent rage. "This is not over," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "This will never be over." Captain Foster's response was quiet, but carried perfectly in the sudden silence. "You are correct about one thing, Magistrate. This is not over. We have documentation. We have witnesses. We have evidence. And come morning, we will have justice." Beaumont mounted his horse and rode away without another word, leaving behind only the burning torches guttering in the mud, and the smell of smoke and fear. We extinguished the fires quickly. They had not yet taken deep hold. The damage was superficial, scorched paint and blackened boards that could be repaired. Mount Zion Baptist Church still stood, wounded but unbroken. As dawn began to break over the Cumberland Mountains, I stood outside the church with Reverend Porter, Captain Foster, and Representative Johnson, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Will there truly be justice?" I asked quietly. Representative Johnson looked at me with eyes that had seemed too much broken promise to offer easy comfort. "There will be consequences," he said. "Federal investigators are already interested in Klan activity in this region. With the evidence Captain Foster has gathered, we can make prosecutions stick. But justice, real justice," he shook his head, "that is a longer road than any of us will walk in our lifetimes." The days following the siege brought changes to Coopersville that no one could have anticipated. Federal marshals arrived within a week, led by a stern man named Raymond Cross, who had served in the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. He set up an office in the courthouse magistrate Beaumont's own territory and began taking depositions. I was called to testify on the third day. The makeshift courtroom was packed with spectators, both colored and white, all of them watching to see whether justice might actually reach into a small Tennessee town and extract some measure of accountability from the powerful men who had ruled it for so long. Magistrate Beaumont sat in the front row with his attorney, a slick-dressed man from Knoxville who smelled of expensive cigars and cheaper morals. Beaumont's face was a mask of calm contempt, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed ceaselessly against his knee. Marshal Cross asked me to recount the events of November 14th. I told him everything: the warnings, the vandalism, the quiet threats, the final siege. I spoke clearly and without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight. When I finished, Beaumont's attorney rose to cross-examine me. "Miss Holloway," he began, his tone dripping with false courtesy, "you claim that Magistrate Beaumont threatened you and your church, but isn't it true that he actually offered you safe passage out of Coopersville, offered you money and a ticket to Memphis?" "He did," I acknowledged. "So he tried to protect you, to save your life, and yet you characterize this as a threat." "He offered me escape from violence he himself had organized," I said quietly. "That is not protection. That is a guilty conscience seeking to limit its own culpability." A ripple of whispers ran through the courtroom. The attorney's jaw tightened. "You have no proof that Magistrate Beaumont organized anything. You have only speculation, and I have his own words," I interrupted. "He told me explicitly that 300 men would come. He knew the exact number, the exact night, the exact plan. He said it was beyond his control, but that was a lie. It was entirely within his control because he controlled it." The attorney tried to regain his footing. "The magistrate is a respected member of this community, a church-going man, a defender of tradition and order. Are we truly to believe he would organize an attack on a church?" Marshal Cross stood. "If I may, Counselor, we have testimony from 17 witnesses placing Magistrate Beaumont at the scene, directing the mob. We have records that Captain Foster kept over 2 years, documenting Beaumont's connection to Klan activities. We have financial records showing Beaumont purchased large quantities of kerosene and torches in the week before the attack. The evidence is overwhelming." The attorney sat down, his face red dot. "Over the next 3 days, the federal inquiry heard from dozens of witnesses. Captain Foster presented his meticulously kept records, names, dates, incidents, connections between Klan violence and Coopersville's power structure. Representative Johnson provided testimony about the broader pattern of terror across Tennessee. The 20 Union veterans who had defended Mount Zion spoke of what they had witnessed, but the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. On the 4th day, a young white man named Daniel Reed took the stand. He was perhaps 20 years old, his face pale and drawn, his hands shaking as he swore his oath. I recognized him. He worked as a clerk in Magistrate Beaumont's office. "Mr. Reed," Marshal Cross began gently, "tell us what you know about the events of November 14th. Reed's voice was barely above a whisper. "I kept the records, all of them. Magistrate Beaumont had me maintain a ledger of every Klan meeting, every member, every action they planned. He said it was for organizational purposes, to keep everyone accountable to each other. He said it was necessary for order." "And do you have this ledger?" Reed reached into his coat and withdrew a leather-bound book, placing it on the marshal's desk with trembling hands. "Everything is in here. Names, dates, plans, including the detailed organization of the attack on Mount Zion Baptist Church." The courtroom erupted. Magistrate Beaumont leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You traitorous little silence." Marshal Cross's voice cracked like a whip. "Magistrate Beaumont, sit down or I will have you removed." Beaumont sat, but his eyes remained locked on Daniel Reed with murderous intensity. Marshal Cross opened the ledger and began to read aloud. The entries were damning, meticulous records of every act of terror perpetrated across 3 counties. All of it organized, sanctioned, and often personally directed by Magistrate Horace Beaumont. "Why?" I heard myself ask, speaking directly to Daniel Reed across the crowded courtroom. "Why did you come forward?" He looked at me then, his young face aged by guilt and shame. "Because I was there that night. I saw the church burning. I saw 30 people inside who would rather die than abandon their faith. And I realized that everything I had been told about order, about tradition, about the natural way of things, was a lie built on cruelty. I could not live with being part of that anymore." When the inquiry concluded on the 6th day, Marshal Cross issued his findings. Magistrate Horace Beaumont would be arrested and tried in federal court on charges of conspiracy to commit arson, attempted murder, and violation of civil rights. 17 other prominent citizens of Coopersville would face similar charges. The trials would take months, the appeals even longer. Some would be convicted, others would escape on technicalities. Magistrate Beaumont himself would eventually serve 3 years in federal prison before being released on a medical exemption, his health broken, his power shattered, his name synonymous with the very hatred he had tried to preserve. But the most important change was quieter, harder to measure. On the Sunday following the inquiry, Mount Zion Baptist Church held services as usual. But when we arrived that morning, we found something unexpected: a group of white townspeople standing outside, led by Daniel Reed. "We came to apologize," Reed said simply. "We cannot undo what was done. We cannot restore what was taken. But we wanted you to know that not everyone in Coopersville shares the hatred that came to your door." Reverend Porter studied them in silence for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the church entrance. "You are welcome to worship with us," he said. "All are welcome in God's house." Some accepted, most did not that day. But it was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but real. I am an old woman now, and my hands shake when I write. But I wanted to set down one final account of the events that changed my life, and the life of Coopersville all those years ago. Mount Zion Baptist Church still stands. The scorch marks have long since been painted over, the damaged boards replaced. But if you know where to look, you can still see the faint shadows where the flames tried to claim us. We keep those shadows deliberately visible, a reminder that hatred came for us and failed. Reverend Thomas Porter passed in 1927, his funeral attended by more than 300 people of all colors. Captain William Foster lived to see 83 years, spending his final decades as a teacher at the colored school. We built with the compensation money the federal government eventually paid us. Representative Marcus Johnson went on to become a state senator, fighting tirelessly for justice until his death in 1930-5. The 20 Union veterans who defended us are all gone now, but their names are carved on a memorial stone in the churchyard. Heroes whose color mattered less than their conviction that some things are worth defending. Daniel Reed never returned to Coopersville after the trials. I heard he moved west and became a schoolteacher, spending his life trying to atone for the ledger he once kept. I hope he found peace. I hope he understood that his courage in coming forward mattered more than his complicity in staying silent. Magistrate Horace Beaumont died in 1923, bitter and broken, attended only by a paid nurse. His name is not spoken with respect in Coopersville anymore. The children who pass his grave do not even know who he was, and that erasure from memory is perhaps the most complete justice of all. As for me, I never married. I devoted my life to Mount Zion Baptist Church, serving as secretary, teacher, and eventually deacon. I have watched 3 generations of children grow up in the safety we fought for. I have seen laws change, seen some justice done, seen the arc of history bend slowly toward something better, though never as quickly or completely as we hoped. People sometimes ask me if I was afraid that night, when 300 men surrounded our church, with torches and hatred. The truth is, I was terrified. We all were, but we learned something important in that darkness, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something matters more than fear. We learned that resistance does not require perfection, only persistence. We learned that justice may be slow and incomplete, but it is still worth fighting for. We learned that even in the darkest moments, when evil seems overwhelming and escape seems wise, there is power in simply refusing to yield. The world has changed since 1898. Wars have been fought, laws have been passed, progress has been made, but the fundamental lesson of that November night remains unchanged, that ordinary people, when pushed beyond endurance, can find extraordinary courage, that a small church full of frightened believers can stand against a mob and survive, that 20 old soldiers can remember their convictions and ride to the defense of strangers, that a young clerk can choose conscience over comfort. These are the stories that matter. These are the truths worth preserving. I write this now because I feel my time drawing short. The doctors tell me my heart is failing, and I suspect they are correct. But before I go, I wanted to ensure that someone would remember, would know, would understand what happened here and what it meant. Mount Zion Baptist Church is more than timber and nails. It is a promise that we exist, that we matter, that we will endure. And on the night of November 14th, when 300 men came to burn that promise to ash, they learned a truth that hatred never quite understands, that some lights cannot be extinguished, no matter how dark the night. My name is Grace Holloway. I was a seamstress, a cleaning woman, a church secretary, simple work done by a simple woman. but I was also a witness to courage, a participant in resistance, a survivor of hatred's attempt to erase us from existence. And I am writing this so that you, whoever you are, whenever you read this, will know, we were here, we stood firm, we survived, and in surviving we won. End of recovered testimony. The journal was discovered in a sealed box in the Mount Zion Baptist Church archives in 1998, exactly 100 years after the events described. The church still stands and still serves its congregation. The memorial stone honoring the 20 Union veterans remains in the churchyard, visited by historians and descendants alike. Grace Holloway's grave is marked with a simple headstone bearing the inscription, "She stood firm." No other words were needed. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing it with others who need to hear these forgotten histories. Where are you watching from, and what stories from your own community deserve to be remembered? Let us know in the comments below. These stories of courage and resistance belong to all of us, and together, we ensure they are never forgotten.